questions based off of that information. And technically you can't use that information to discriminate against that candidate for the job either. So a lot of information may come out, but again, as long as it's not a question that you've illegally asked, then you're okay to know that information. Yes?
You may have this in here later, and if you do, that's fine, just
Okay.
answer it then, but in your experience, what have been a couple of the best questions that you've asked, and you've got some connections to education.
Mm-hmm.
So what would be some of the best interview questions that you've asked over the years that would also apply to us hiring teachers or people, educators?
Let me think on that here for a minute, because I do have a variety that I use. Like I said, I like to ask a lot of questions about how they handle conflict. You know, because really, not only in the classroom with kids, I mean, and you could probably come up with some hypothetical situations where, you know, you have a rowdy kid, and you know, what kind of processes would you follow to try to keep discipline in your classroom? You know, if it's a teacher that you're hiring or something like that. You know, how do you get along with your coworkers? So I do ask a lot of that. Another thing that I ask about is, like in my situation, are they a team player? What characteristics do you have that make you be a good team player? Those kind of things. I'm just trying to think of some unique questions for you.
And that was one of my, I guess one of my questions too,
Yeah.
was the way you just phrased the last one, because if you ask the question, are you a team player?
Right.
Invariably they say yes.
And that is always the key, is to try and phrase your question so that you get an expanded answer, not just a yes or no question. I mean, because otherwise it's hard for you to really get that person's characteristics or their personality or how they're going to be able to handle some of those situations. And that's why I said, even like on the strengths and weaknesses question, I pose it as, you know, assets and liabilities, what are your 3 strengths, and give me the examples how you use them. Not just tell me, oh, I'm you know, dependable, I'm loyal, and I'm trustworthy. Well, okay, but explain on that, expand on that, because it does give you more insight when they're able to give you an extended answer on some of those situations. Did I have a question back there? Okay. Other than that, you know, a lot of times too in our situations, do you like to work alone? Do you like to work with others? How do you get along with others? What kind of people do you find it most difficult to work with? What kind of students do you find most difficult to manage in your classroom? I mean, that's a way that you can ask questions on how you deal with it. How do you handle a teacher who's not completing their goals and objectives? You know, you can, depending on what kind of position that you're hiring for. How do you handle 2 students fighting in the hallway? You know, make it be that they're able to give some expanded answers on that, if you will. Because obviously discipline, classroom discipline is a big component of education and some of those things as well. Coaching, if you're looking at people for coaching, I mean, there's probably some questions you can throw in there about their coaching style or how they manage team dynamics. A lot of different things like that. What I did not do, and I can send to you, Doug, is I'll send you a couple of my interview templates that I use for different positions. That way they'll give you guys some of those questions. I didn't think to include that, so just remind me if I forget to send that to you.
I always ask questions about attendance. But you had said, like, you can't ask how many work-related injuries, so you can't ask, well, how many days were you absent last year?
The way you phrase it though, I mean, you can say, can you tell me about your attendance history at work? It's okay because it is important to know attendance. It's just that if they tell you that they were gone because they had cancer last year and they missed 6 months of work,
Right.
it's kind of hard to stay away from taking it the next step. But I think attendance is important, and I think that's one of the ways that I usually phrase that, is I'm trying to think. And again, my template will have a couple of those on there. Because obviously attendance is important for us too. I think you can even word it that way. Obviously attendance is an important part of this position. You know, tell me about your attendance history at work, because you're not asking were they ill, were they hurt, were they whatever. You definitely have to find what are those key elements that you need in that position and focus your questions around that. And you know, if you Google out there situational interview questions, behavioral interview questions, you can find all kinds of examples out there to help you figure out how to word some of those questions that you're looking for. There's all kind of free sites out there. And I do have on one of my slides a couple of those resource tabs, I believe. But SHRM, the Society for Human Resource Management, it's a very cheap membership, and you get sample job descriptions, you get sample policies, you have a not Snapchat, I'm sure they probably have that too, but a blog situation, and I get like emails every day where people can just go out and post a question and other people respond to it. And it's only like $199 or $189 membership for a year. So it's a really great investment. Plus, they also have attorneys on staff that you can send a legal question to. Obviously, in education, there's a couple of key people you're working with already from an education standpoint, but definitely something to think about. A good resource out there. All right. So training and development also is an important part. And, you know, obviously you guys do a lot of staff development throughout the year, so there's key things that you're always hitting on. Same with any business environment. Obviously there's certain topics that OSHA requires us to cover every year: personal protective equipment, bloodborne pathogens, safe lifting techniques, those kind of things. Probably some of the same things you probably cover with your staff members potentially on some of that. Probably even more so, how do you handle critical elements or a shooter in the workplace? You know, a lot of that, like I said, you don't want to think about, but you need to be prepared for. And so hopefully you've got some safety teams in place that do talk through some of those situations. Keeping records and documentation is also critical, no matter if it's job performance, training, whatever it might be, because sometimes you do have to go back and prove that you did train somebody on a particular topic. And it seems like might be keeping a lot of documentation, but document. I can't stress that enough, no matter if it's the business world or the education world, having that documentation is key, especially, for example, career development plans or performance plans. More so in your case if you have a teacher, a tenured teacher who is not performing to your expectations, and you have to figure out whether or not you're going to be able to retain them on your staff. Well, obviously you can't just fire them, right? You have to be able to prove that you gave that person an opportunity to correct their behavior first before you take steps, especially in a union environment. So a lot of times you're going to put that staff member on an action plan that they have to be able to reach those attainable goals, and how are they going to do that before you can take that next step. So again, a lot of that falls into not only documentation, but what your plan is for that person in order to be successful. Obviously, you know, I always tell my managers, we're not going to set anybody up to fail. You know, if we're going to put somebody on an action plan, it needs to be reasonable, attainable goals, because sometimes they come in just wanting to fire somebody, and I'm like, whoa, hold the bus. You know, we're not just going to jump into that, because is the problem on how you're managing that person, or is it because that person really can't do the job anymore? And to give you an example of that, when I first started at Hughes Brothers, it was probably into my first or second year there, we had a purchasing assistant who had been there for 23 years, doing pretty much that job the entire time. And her manager, the purchasing manager, had been there maybe about 3 years, because she's only been there about 1.5 years more than I had. She wanted that gal fired right then and there. And so we kind of talked through what are the challenges, what are the problems. And we did end up doing an action plan with that person, because we did find there were some deficiencies there on how the job needed to get done. So we set those timelines up, and that employee chose not to meet any of them. She basically just said, I'm not doing that. So in that case, we did end up separating her from employment, even though she had been there 23 years, because she chose to not change her behavior based on the reasonable goals that were set for her, or the reasonable job, I guess, expectations that were set for her. So they do work. I mean, and again, in education, like I said, I know you've got some different hoops to go through if you do have to fire a tenured teacher or something like that. But again, it's all about the documentation and how you get from the beginning to the end of that, making sure that you're doing it fairly and equitably and legally, first and foremost. So compensation and benefits. There's a lot of points on this, because obviously there's a lot of different things out there that impact us. I mean, most of us aren't probably just going to go to work if we don't get a paycheck, right? I mean, most of us need that paycheck. It's not all about the money, but yet it is, right? I mean, if we don't have the right component of benefits for employees, they're not going to want to stay at our place of employment. And that doesn't mean that everybody can be competitive in every area. But I mean, I think one of the advantages that I see, especially in the world of education, is especially in the state of Nebraska, you guys are able to all be under the Educators Alliance, whatever the plan is. So you have, 10,000, 15,000 lives on your insurance policy, which really makes it better for your schools, because that's a bargaining chip when you go to negotiate your health insurance. Where me, right now, I'm kind of looking at, do we join a captive program so that we have more lives? Because we had a lot of people absent last year, and we're facing a 20% increase in our health insurance renewal for this year, which is huge, you know, compared to what it's been in the last year. I think there was a 0% increase this year for schools coming in, so I mean, that's, like I said, you just never know what's gonna happen based with your employment, but obviously benefits are key. With this, I think the other thing to do is making sure that the policy, or the benefits and the things that you have in place fit the needs of your employees, and are there things that you can do that aren't gonna cost your district any more money? That I don't know, because you guys have to be within a certain budget, right? So there's certain things that you're not able to just throw out there because you do have taxpayer dollars and you have a set budget that you have to work with. In a business environment, especially a for-profit business, you don't have as many limitations because you have a little bit bigger pocketbook to draw from when you're trying to determine what those benefits are. I think the other thing that I would say for this area is educate your employees on what those benefits are, because I think that's usually what the downfall is for any businesses. A lot of the employees don't fully understand how all those benefits work. For example, I'm pretty sure does everybody in the schools have an education or an employee assistance program, right? But not everybody always realizes what that is and how that can help them. And I think, you know, that is one resource that I think too, even in my workplace, gets underused. You know, and we always try to do paycheck stuffers to remind people that that's there, or if somebody comes to me with, you know, they've got this situation going on at home, for example, somebody's going through a separation and possibly a divorce, something like that. I always remind them, use your EAP benefit. It's confidential. You and your family members, if there's kids involved, they can go see a counselor free of charge and help them through this situation if need be. Under this too, job descriptions, job analysis, job evaluations. Obviously, I think it's pretty much a requirement that you have to do a staff evaluation of all your teachers. Is that once a year, twice a year? I can't remember what your, depending on who it is. Okay. One of the things that's important too, if you do have to let go of a staff member down the road, do you have a job description in place for that? Do you know what those performance expectations are? You know, so again, whether that's for-profit, nonprofit, education, that's also a key component that you need to make sure that you have job descriptions in place in order to help you evaluate what it is that you need to be doing there. Other than that, anybody else have any unique benefits that you have in your district that maybe aren't in other districts that you would want to share? Okay. Like I said, there's a lot of different things that go into this. Moving on then is to compliance issues. And with that, as I was talking earlier, I'm sure educators, and I know Perry Law Firm or whoever you work with, and another one is pretty much your two in Nebraska, which obviously you want to use somebody that's well familiar with the education world. We have somebody that we work pretty closely with at Hughes Brothers too, Klein Williams, based out of Lincoln and Omaha. But yeah, if you don't know a good attorney, you want to find one. Because there are definitely going to be situations where you want to just make sure that you are actually taking the right steps. I mean, if you have a bad feeling about a situation, trust your gut on that. Get an attorney involved, network with the other people, you know, and just say, hey, this is my situation, what would you do? And I do that a lot with my network people too, because one of the things is somebody out there has faced the same situation as you before. You're probably not the first one to have to go through that. So networking is really key when it comes to that. And so, I mean, there's a lot of organizations that you can join. I'm sure there's probably the superintendents meet, the principals meet, so that's a great time to network. As you saw on the resources, I had found a quick article on all of the things that Trump had signed into law in the last year, and I know not all of them were true laws. I just found that interesting just because I know, looking at what the legislature is doing right now, obviously there's a couple of key things out there that are going to potentially impact education, depending on what happens with those. But compliance is one of those things that, you know, I think it's more difficult every year. I mean, I've been doing HR 20 years now, and you think it'd be easier after 20 years, but I think it's more difficult than ever. I mean, even in schools, you've got the bullying and the social media. I mean, my goodness, I would not want to go back to high school today, I'll just say that, right? Because I don't know how I would do it with Snapchat and all these other things that they have going on. I run it into the workplace too. You know, even with adults, I feel like I'm running a junior high school most days because it's still, you know, people fight with one another and they come in and they're like, well, so-and-so posted this about me on Facebook, and I'm like, I'm not getting involved in that, you know, one of the situations where, I mean, it was pretty defaming what